Merlin, the revered wizard of Arthurian legend, frantically burns a stack of scrolls in a dimly lit cave, his trembling hands betraying the confidence immortalized in medieval tapestries. These aren't magical incantations, they're formulas, astronomical calculations, and illusion techniques stolen from Arab scholars. Scattered around him, colored powders, mechanical contraptions, and primitive chemistry equipment. A voice approaches outside. Quickly, he kicks everything under a ragged cloth, adopts a mystical posture, and his eyes change no longer panicked, but piercing and otherworldly. The greatest advisor to King Arthur wasn't a powerful sorcerer, but history's most successful con man, a charlatan whose elaborate deception created a kingdom, manipulated a continent, and rewrote the purpose of power itself. The fire dies, the cave settles, and the image of Merlin burning his notes feels like a betrayal, thrilling, cinematic, impossible to reconcile with what most of us were taught. That frantic man, with his powders and arithmetic scribbled on parchment, does not appear in the schoolbooks, the theme park plaques, or the neatly illustrated children's editions stacked in airport shops. Now the story tightens into the version everyone knows, a benevolent, supernatural helper who shapes destiny itself. Let's lay out that version exactly as it has been packaged for centuries, the comfortable shape that everything else in this investigation will prod and, eventually, dismantle. For many centuries, the dominant story of Merlin has been shaped like a hymn. He is the wise, otherworldly mentor who guides the destiny of a nation. Born in some tellings of a mortal woman and a demonic father, in others part spirit and part druid, Merlin is attributed powers that exceed any earthly skill. He reads the future. He changes shape. He commands storms. He pulls strings across generations, counseling kings with prophetic calm. In page after illuminated page, he appears as the archetypal sage, a figure who knows what will be and who molds the world to that knowledge. History books and children's stories present him as the axis of Arthurian order. In those versions, he is the orchestrator, enabling Arthur's miraculous ascent, arranging the sword in the stone stunt that proves kingship, establishing the Round Table as a moral institution, foretelling the rise and the fall of Camelot. Films and TV series complete the job by dressing the story in cinematic certainty. Merlin becomes, for mass audiences, the reassuring old man who sits behind the throne and whose counsel makes heroes legible and victories inevitable. Religious scribes and medieval manuscripts contributed another layer. In those sources, Merlin is often given a divine color. He is shown as a figure whose gifts serve Christian ends, a prophet whose visions clear the way for a Christianized kingdom, an instrument in a providential narrative that places a righteous monarchy at the center of Christian civilization. In monasteries and churches, and later in cathedral art and tapestries, Merlin's image is softened, sanctified, and given a purpose that aligns with ecclesiastical authority. The sanitized version has always been convenient. It solves problems. For the church, Merlin's divine gravity made pagan pasts less embarrassing. His story could be folded into Christian providence. For kings and ruling dynasties, it supplied a mystical pedigree. If your line could be connected to Arthur and shepherded by Merlin, your claim to rule acquired a halo. For emerging national identities in England in particular, the story served as a usable myth. It carried the weight of ancestry, destiny, and cultural grandeur in a neat package. For industry, modern and medieval, Merlin was profit and prestige. Pageants, tapestries, plays, and eventually theme parks, novels, and box office spectacles. Listen to how confident the official voices sound when they tell it. A school textbook can read like a sermon. Merlin guided Arthur with wisdom bestowed by God, ensuring the triumph of civilization. A medieval chronicle rephrased for modern exhibition panels might intone. Merlin prophesied the order of kings, foreseeing the destiny of the realm. A patriotic speech, sung in the pageant of empire building, will sweeten the myth into civic virtue. From Merlin's counsel came a golden age of chivalry, proof that our nation's roots are noble and ancient. These are not neutral statements. They are claims that tidy history into moral certainty. The tone is deliberately reassuring. The pieces fit. Conflicts resolve. Disagreements soften into moral lessons. The ugly realities of war, opportunism, and political brutality are amputated from the story. The version that gets taught and sold is crafted not only to entertain, but to soothe the anxieties of subjects and subjects-to-be. It answers a fundamental need. It gives power a face that is both paternal and infallible. Who gains from a Merlin like that? The beneficiaries are obvious when you look at the map of influence. Church institutions seeking moral authority, monarchs and dynasties seeking legitimacy, national projects seeking mythic origin stories, and, in later centuries, an entertainment industry keen to monetize nostalgia. Each of these actors can rework elements of the tale to suit their aims. The church emphasizes prophecy and divine sanction. Monarchs emphasize lineage and the sword. Nation builders emphasize cultural continuity and heroic founding. Producers emphasize spectacle. Each layer of adoption strips away inconvenient parts and polishes what remains. Visually, the official Merlin is easy to stage. A cloaked figure in torch-lit halls, tapestries on castle walls, a bearded counselor in a fresco pointing toward a distant dawn. Those images sell well. They are comfortable, repeatable, and reassuring. They are the exact visual fuel museums and tourist brochures depend upon. A lineage of kings, a tapestry of miracles, and the sense that social order was once blessed into existence by an unassailable sage. But comfort is not evidence, and the neatness of a story is not proof of its truth. When you hold the official version beside the messy reality of contested manuscripts, competing warring interests, lost archaeological strata, and political opportunism, cracks begin to appear. Those cracks are not mere antiquarian curiosity. They are signs of an active process by which stories are pruned, polished, and propagated. You have been taught this version because it is useful. You saw it in films. You might have seen it on greeting cards. That familiarity is precisely what made it effective. It makes you feel that history has a moral center and that center was once governed by a man whose wisdom was absolute. But if the official Merlin exists mainly to serve agendas, the question becomes, what agendas? And what was cut to let that figure stand so tall? We will not pry apart the myth with mere contempt. The task is to retrace the steps, where the story came from, who shaped it, and what the thin places the seams between legend and craft reveal. The next sections look at the record itself, the oldest texts, the gaps in time, the regional politics, and the ways medieval writers stitched disparate traditions together. We will follow the trail from oral tale to printed legend, and ask why the legend was made to be so neat. Before we continue, a quick note from the makers. Thanks for watching this investigation this far. This channel is young, and every subscription helps us dig deeper into stories the classroom skipped. If you find this kind of historical truth-telling useful, subscribing and sharing brings us closer to 1,000 supporters, a small threshold that helps fund more archival work, more interviews, and more episodes. It matters, and your support keeps this kind of history alive. The neat story, the one that fits on a poster and in a museum placard, now needs to be tested against the documents and the dirt, the things historians actually rely on. The first shocks emerge there, where dates do not line up, where authors reinvent characters, and where the geography of legend resists physical confirmation. Read on. Those first fissures change everything you think you know. Start with a fact that sounds like a small complaint. The Merlin we all know does not appear in contemporary records from the era he supposedly lived. That absence is the first fissure. You learn Merlin as an ancient presence at Arthur's side, timeless and unbroken. The historical one medieval author gifts Merlin prophetic verses, another gives him miracles, another makes him the architect of Arthurian order. No single, continuous tradition hands us an unbroken Merlin. Rather, a sequence of literary edits build the Merlin we now believe in. This patchwork explains another noticeable inconsistency. Merlin's powers shift depending on the author. In Geoffrey, the emphasis is on prophetic speech and cunning counsel. In later romances, Merlin's toolkit broadens to include shape-shifting, enchantments, and dramatic feats of magic. By Mallory, Merlin is almost a mythic machine capable of shaping narrative events for moral instruction. This variability is not just whimsical storytelling. It signals purposeful invention. When authors needed Merlin to perform a particular ideological function, to prove divine sanction, to excuse conquest, to instill chivalric norms, they rewired him. The lack of a stable biography across sources is a red flag that the character is literary and rhetorical rather than historical. Timing is not the only problem. Geography is another. The canonical sites of legend Tintagel, Glastonbury, and the shadowy Camelot are useful scene props, but they do not line up neatly with an early 5th or 6th century imperial court. Excavations at Tintagel reveal an important post-Roman seaport with Mediterranean connections in the early Middle Ages, but they do not reveal an imperial city or a palace complex on the scale the legends describe. Glastonbury becomes significant later, particularly when monks there began to associate the abbey with Arthur and Merlin as a way of attracting pilgrims and patronage. Camelot, on the other hand, is a problem that has no archaeological answer. It is a literary center, not a site tied to a single, discoverable locus in early medieval Britain. In short, the topography of the myth looks very different when scholars ask for the physical traces that would support a large, organized polity in the 5th to 6th centuries. Another crucial fissure appears if you listen to the prophecies themselves. Geoffrey presents Merlin as a seer whose pronouncements forecast kings and wars. Look closely and a common medieval tactic becomes apparent: retroactive prophecy. Geoffrey, writing in the 12th century, attributes predictions to Merlin that align with events that had already occurred by his own time. This is a classic technique. Write a prophecy that seems to predict current events and use it to give contemporary rulers a sense of inevitability and divine sanction. If a prophecy seems to predict Norman rule or legitimizes particular lineages, then Geoffrey's chronicle becomes not merely narrative, but an instrument of political validation. Why would this matter? Because Geoffrey was writing in a period when Anglo-Norman rulers were still consolidating power over Celtic peoples. A convenient historical prop, Merlin's prophetic authority could be used to smooth fractures between conquered populations. The advantage is clear. If a legendary seer foretold the current order, resistance looks both feudal and sacrilegious. The narrative changes the political calculus. What looks like impartial storytelling becomes an act of historical persuasion, one that favors those in power and flattens the messy reality of conquest and collaboration. Sources also contradict each other in smaller but telling ways. The character Merlin in Welsh tradition is not simply a tame court sage. In some Welsh poems, he is portrayed as a mad prophet of the wilderness, a figure reacting to trauma, potentially a scapegoat for the costs of war. Ambrosius, another component, shows up in Roman-era sources as a leader resisting Saxon incursions. Geoffrey fuses these threads, creating a hybrid figure who does the ideological labor he needed. When you place these original elements side by side with Geoffrey's version, the seams are obvious. Consider, too, the documentary weight of the earliest manuscripts. Manuscripts and chronicles are not neutral windows. They are instruments curated by those who commissioned them. Monks, royal clerks, and court poets all had incentives to emphasize certain narratives and suppress others. A chronicle preserved in a Norman-sponsored scriptorium will tend to sanitize inconvenient alliances, Forget the names of certain rivals and highlight moments that benefit patrons. Document absence becomes as telling as document presence. What is omitted, who is ignored, and which local actors are flattened into a single people, these choices quietly reshape historical memory. Now move from manuscripts to the lived realities that would have given rise to a figure like Merlin. Post-Roman Britain was not a neat political succession. It was a time of fragmentation, small polities, shifting allegiances, Roman administrative residues, and renewed contacts across the Irish Sea and the Atlantic. Knowledge, especially classical learning, was scarce and mobile. Men who could read Latin or calculate the heavens offered disproportionate advantage. It is plausible that advisors with exceptional technical knowledge existed. Men who could interpret eclipses, track seasons, understand rudimentary pharmacology, or produce convincing theatrical displays. But those are skills, not magic. The leap from technical competence to the category miracle worker requires a social context predisposed to read skill as supernatural and a political context eager to monetize that perception. Here's a concrete example of how practical knowledge could become miraculous. Suppose an advisor knows that a lunar eclipse will occur on a certain night. He times a council or ritual to that night, and he orchestrates smoke or dyes that make the eclipse appear blood red. Observers in a world where eclipses were rare and terrifying might believe the darkened moon is a divine sign. Now, add selective poisoning or the presence of plants that induce temporary delirium in some assembled chiefs. When only the warlord's allies appear unharmed because they were pre-treated or warned, the scene looks like divine protection. Over time, the tale becomes not a piece of political theater, but a miracle. Repeat the theater, and the miracle hardens into tradition. Recount it in a chronicle centuries later, and you have prophecy. This is not an accusation of an isolated fraud. It is an account of social dynamics. In a collapsing world, knowledge is power. Those who could convert astronomy into spectacle or herb lore into cures had huge leverage. They could create a performative aura of authority around a warlord. They could also decide who spoke and who was silenced. It is easy, perhaps inevitable, that storytellers later would transmute such episodes into the language of enchantment and destiny. Scrutinize the timelines of key authors, and you see motives align with invention. Geoffrey of Monmouth writes under Norman rule. Robert de Boron reworks Merlin in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, seeking to Christianize the figure and make him part of a providential history that leads to Christendom's moral ends. Thomas Malory, writing in the 15th century, layers on chivalric ideals that suit late medieval notions of honor, courtly love, and martial nobility. Each author is not merely telling a tale. Each is using an inherited figure and reshaping it to serve a present agenda. That is the work of propaganda in slow motion. Other textual curiosities intensify doubt. Many of Merlin's prophecies are vague allegories that can be retrofitted to many events, a technique that allows authors to claim prescience after the fact. The practice of retrofitting prophecy creates an appearance of consistency where none exists. It is the textual equivalent of a conjurer's misdirection. Keep the audience attentive to the pattern while the real manipulation happens in the margins. The discrepancies accumulate. Different regions remember different elements. Welsh tradition preserves Merlin in a way that emphasizes prophetic madness. Anglo-Norman texts recast him as a genius of statecraft. Church manuscripts sacralize him. Place names accumulate as needed. Tintagel becomes associated with Arthur through later medieval inventions. Glastonbury's monks recover Arthurian relics and promote pilgrimage to strengthen local claims to prestige and property. Historians call this process mythic accretion, the slow layering of meaning upon a kernel of earlier stories. It is not, in itself, a proof of malicious intent. More often, it's a political and cultural economy of meaning-making. Communities invest in stories that produce status, security, and revenue. Second, the figure of Merlin is demonstrably composite, stitched from Welsh prophetic fragments, Roman-era leaders, oral performance traditions, and medieval literary invention. Third, once a myth like Merlin enters the archives into Jeffrey's or Mallory's texts, it can be shaped and reshaped by institutions that have motives to present power as ordained, moral, or divinely sanctioned. These are not merely literary quibbles. They matter politically. When a populace is presented with a foundational myth that attributes rulership to providential design, that myth has real effects. It alters who is trusted, who is obeyed, and which grievances are considered legitimate. It is exactly the kind of cultural work that successful regimes rely upon. There are dissenting voices and debates among historians, and we will return to those nuances. Some scholars argue that oral traditions may preserve kernels of memory impossible to fully recover, that archaeological finds complicate tidy denial, that syncretic religious forms allowed for more porous boundaries between political performance and religious experience than modern minds assume. These positions are important cautions. They remind us not to leap from difficulty to cynicism. But they do not erase the pattern that for many centuries the Merlin figure was adapted deliberately to serve political, ecclesiastical, and cultural aims. As these fissures accumulate, the comfortable Merlin of posters and theme parks dissolves into something else, a human-made construct, a layered story deployed by actors who needed to make order look preordained. That realization is not merely corrective, it is freeing. It shows how narratives are built and how they can be dismantled. That is the value of scrutiny. There is one final observation before we move on. Myth-making is not always a cynical conspiracy. It can be survival. In times of social collapse, people make stories that restore meaning and cohesion. Advisors who staged ceremonies, mobilized knowledge, and engineered public consent might have believed in their acts. They might have been desperate to create stability. The story of Merlin, then, is morally ambivalent, a testament to human ingenuity and to how easily ingenuity can be used to concentrate power under the guise of destiny. When you see the next tapestry in a museum or read the next glossy retelling, remember this. You are looking at layers of invention, choices about what to preserve, and decisions about what to leave out. Merlin the magician may not have been real in the way popular culture imagines, but the social work he performed providing meaning, consolidating authority, shaping identity was very real indeed. And that truth, uncomfortable and human, will be the focus of the next part of our investigation. He did not live in a tower of glass or in the gilded dream the tapestries show. The man behind the name, the cluster of men and women who would later be stitched into a single figure called Merlin, lived in corridors of compromise, behind curtained windows, and around tables scarred by spilled wine and hurried ink. Imagine a low-ceilinged chamber, the air thick with wood smoke and the sweet rot of drying herbs. On a battered table lie coils of twine, a cracked astrolabe, a bundle of vellum maps, and jars whose labels have long since rubbed away. Picture him bent over a crude counting board, scraping at chalk lines as candles gutter. This is not a mystic at ease. This is a craftsman rehearsing his next illusion. His days were a ledger of errands that made power look possible. He sent runners to the coasts to ask which ships had come in and who had sold their grain. He bribed porters to keep silent. He kept lists of marriages, debts, and old odes, the paper trail of social leverage. He cataloged which churches had what relics, which abbots owed favors, and which petty lords still argued by blood. He read fragments of Latin texts scavenged from ruined villas, copied out astronomical tables refined in distant cities, and adapted medicinal recipes that would make a man's stomach stop or settle. To some he seemed learned, to others terrifyingly informed. To those in power he was indispensable because he made uncertainty look like design. But indispensable is a precarious thing. One failed counsel and the crowd that called him wise could call him traitor the next week. Rival advisors prowled like dogs for scraps of influence. A neighboring warlord could hire a brighter seer, or a bishop could call him a heretic and sweep away the halo with a sermon. Imagine a quiet night when a messenger arrives with a note. The king doubts you. The note smells of pine and old wax. The next morning, men with short blades come to test your loyalty. The real Merlin learned to sleep with one ear open. His tools were less miraculous than theatrical, but effective. He used the sky as a calendar and a prop. He could read the slow, predictable drift of planets, know when an eclipse would cast the moon into red shadow, and use that predictable terror as a narrative device. He kept pockets of rare minerals, iron oxides that painted smoke a bloody hue when burned, powdered cinnabar that left haunting stains, crushed berries and plant essences that produced hallucinatory dizziness in those forced too close to ceremonial bonfires. He employed simple mechanics to stage wonders, mirrors to redirect torchlight, ropes to move banners at a magical moment, hidden chambers that let a spirit enter a hall unseen. He was a primitive engineer as much as a rhetorician. He managed people the way a river tender moves water through sluices. Scouts and sailors became his eyes. A favored cup-bearer in another lord's hall sent news in the form of spilled salt and a wink. A monk who once owed a favor left a page of a chronicle misfiled where he knew the advisor would see it. He kept secret ledgers, lists of debts and promises that could be called in like storm warnings. Intelligence, in that age, was slow and small. A few days' warning of a crossing army could matter more than the bravest blade. He bartered information for protection. He sold stories that soothed an anxious populace and bought time for a ruler to gather forces. Religion and ritual were an arena he used with care. The late Roman world had not vanished entirely. Clerics remembered chants, formatting, and the pattern of an effective sermon. A clever advisor could arrange a public liturgy that borrowed both from Christian liturgy and older folk rites, producing a performance that felt sacred to everyone present. He learned, and sometimes exploited, the priest's hunger for converts and the druid's residual sway over local rites. To the common people, that hybrid performance looked like an ancient truth being spoken aloud. To the bishops, it was useful if it stabilized a region and helped shepherd souls into church coffers. He navigated both loyalties, sometimes as a bridge, sometimes as a double agent. His relationship with military power was symbiotic and coldly transactional. He knew which warlords had courage and which had desperation. He advised when to appear invincible and when to retreat into pragmatism. He arranged the myths that made a warlord's victory legible, a sword with an origin story, a prophecy read aloud in a market square, a portent staged on the eve of battle. In return, he got protection and resources, sometimes land, sometimes a house beyond the hall, sometimes the silence of those who could not otherwise be paid. But when fortunes shifted, so did the moods of lords. He had to keep alliances like thin glass plates balanced on poles. There were moments of small, human tenderness amid the calculus. He healed a child in one village with a poultice passed down from a Roman medic. He taught a shy scribe how to copy a line of Latin so that language survived another generation. He might have saved a community from famine by advising the sowing of a less familiar grain. Those acts anchored him in local memory as a benefactor. They were also political currency. You saved a life, you earned a story. You earned a story, you bought a loyalty. The same hands that mixed powders to stupefy a crowd could also bind a wound with willow bark. And yet, in private, he was rarely noble. He gambled on rumors. He mistreated those who had outlived their usefulness. He made moral compromises to ensure continuity, advising betrayals at crossroads, arranging marriages that became political hostages, permitting the silencing of rivals by poisoning or exile. Sometimes these choices were argued. He claimed they kept a fragile peace. Sometimes they were quieter self-preservation. He lived by a rule repeated in low voices among his circle. Narrative creates order. control the narrative, and you can. The advisor, our composite Merlin, had everything he needed for a demonstration that could change the map. But demonstrations have costs. The next move would require an audience of equals, a sacred place heavy with meaning, and a sky that would obey the slow arithmetic of the heavens. The place chosen for that performance was older than any of them. The night chosen would be one the elders still remembered as dangerous. The rest, as the chroniclers would later say, was destiny. Or, perhaps, destiny arranged with great skill. Stonehenge is older than most people in that story would imagine. Its stones already weathered into silence when roving bands still vowed fealty once a year. To later eyes, the circle looked like a prehistoric altar. To those who gathered there in late summer of the 5th century, it was a place whose stones remembered seasons and oaths. The landscape around it, low hills, broken watercourses, hummocks of peat made sound travel in a particular way. A whisper could swell into a rumor. A drum could carry like thunder. The location mattered. Ritual at Stonehenge would be framed by memory. The plan was almost bureaucratic in its simplicity. The warlord, anxious about Saxon pressure and petty disputes among local chieftains, sought a coalition. The advisor knew that merely calling a council would not be enough. Councils end with bargaining and violence. He needed an event that would supply moral inevitability. He needed a sign the gods could not ignore. He had consulted manuscript scraps of Roman tables kept in a monk's chest and found a rare gift, an upcoming lunar eclipse. It would be a blood moon by any common language, and in a world that read omens as policy, a blood moon is harder to argue within an army. In the days before the gathering, the advisor worked like a stage director. He sent messengers with sealed orders, which lords would be invited, which accommodations made, which allowances for honor. He arranged the exact placement of fires on the approach roads to cast long, anxious shadows when the council arrived. He instructed the cupbearers, men whose task seemed trivial, to spike small batches of ale with herbs that induced disorientation in the vulnerable, but he warned them to keep a protected cask for allied chiefs. He ensured the warlord's men would be located on the hill where noise from a skirmish could be muffled. He arranged a hidden path where a sword could be planted as evidence of an ancient lineage. He polished an old Roman blade, drilled a ceremonial inscription into its guard, and wrapped it in a ragged ribbon that smelled faintly of myrrh. It would be presented as a relic, as a sign that this warlord's claim had ancient sanction. Think of the night like a chamber play. The chiefs arrived with torches, their cloaks smelling of travel and smoke. The advisor watched them enter Stonehenge's circle under the dull, expectant sky. He had arranged for a small band of men to carry a brazier of crushed minerals, red ochre, iron filings, rare copper refinements, and to release the red smoke at a single signal. He had planted a group of men near the periphery with the poisonous powders and tinctures hidden in leather pouches. He knew which cups to tamper with, which benches to weaken, which tents to spare. He had practiced his part of the performance until his voice sounded like prophecy. When the moon began to slip into the earth's shadow, the advisor's timing came true. The sky darkened. A hush climbed over the assembly. The first breath of red smoke curved into the air, and the moon turned an unnatural, coppery color. In the electric pause, the advisor stepped forward and raised his hands in a gesture half ritual, half showman. He intoned a few words in a language older than most there. The phrase had all the cadence of scripture without necessarily meaning the same thing to every ear. The chiefs shivered. One of the ancient priests, bought or convinced, murmured assent. The warlord was presented with the Roman blade, its edge bright as lightning under the torchlight. The story had a spine now, an origin tale rooted in spectacle. Then the darker part unfolded. Several chiefs, after drinking from cups whispered to be communal, fell ill with a sudden nausea and fever. Some collapsed and were carried to the edge of the circle, where a tent had been prepared. The advisors, protected, Men those who had avoided the spiked ale and had been given a soothing draught beforehand stood untouched and calm. Panic rippled. One elder chief coughed a purple foam into the grass and whispered of curses. Another screamed that the warlord had the favor of the gods and that his enemies were falling under divine wrath. The scene moved from ritual to contagion, and the contagion looked supernatural. No army marched that night. No siege needed to be lifted. The warlord's opponents were compromised, some poisoned, some vomiting in the dirt, some too weak to ride home with any hope of organizing revolt. The advisors networked the runners, the complicit monks, the cupbearers made certain the right rumors took hold. By dawn, the narrative had crystallized. The gods had chosen a leader, and the blood moon had sealed it. A high king, or something like a high king, walked away with new authority. The advisor had engineered consent. The immediate consequences were brutal and effective. Rival families lost sons or leaders to sickness that would not be properly chronicled. Alliances collapsed or were bought anew. The warlord consolidated territories that had resisted him for years. He rewarded the advisor handsomely: a seat at council, lands to fund his experiments, and an oath of protection. The advisor took all, but not without a sour price. Someone noticed inconsistencies. The same cupbearer showed up in two houses. A monk's ledger had a smudged note. Quiet accusations not enough to topple a throne began to thread through the countryside. Fear does not erase curiosity. Where there is power, there is scrutiny. Yet the long-term effect mattered more than any single accusation. The story told that Stonehenge had been a place of destiny. Local song adjusted, and the performance hardened into tradition. That single night was retold as sacred, then sung by bards as if it had always been inevitable. Generations later, the details fray the cup that killed is now described as cursed. The poison becomes a demonic touch. The protected draught becomes holy balm. Over time, people forgot the parts that looked too human: the planning, the bribes, the careful measurements of celestial mechanics. They remembered the blood moon and the warlord crowned. The advisor's trick became a miracle in the popular memory. This event did not stand alone. Variations of the same performance staged omens, targeted eliminations, calculated show of divine favor replayed across the aisles. A coronation where a saint's relic was miraculously found. A victory declared suddenly because a storm turned at the precise moment of a charge. A treaty sealed after a dream interpreted publicly. Each incident layered the idea that rulership was more than force. It was destiny confirmed by signs. The advisor's methods: astronomical calculation, strategic intoxication, theatrical staging, and selective violence became a toolkit others copied. Where there had once been small, local rulerships, a few powerful houses began to appear as if ordained. There is another angle worth tracking. For those not in the circles of power, the Stonehenge event was terrifying and binding. Communities that had once shrugged off a distant chieftain's edicts now whispered that obedience was pious, rebellion was sacrilegious. The advisor knew how to translate physical fear into moral obligation. That translation is the essence of political theology. Make something look sacred, and it becomes a moral crime to oppose it. What looked like piety on the surface did the work of consolidation underneath. And yet, the choreography of that night also planted the seeds for later skepticism. A few survivors murmured in hidden corners about the odd taste in the ale, about the man who polished the blade in the dark. A traveling carpenter, who had been paid to mend a tent pole, muttered about the precise placement of the brazier. These small observations rarely overturned empires, but they persisted as hints and, centuries later, would be read by a different kind of reader, the chronicler who did not want everything to read like Providence. For now, at that time, the advisor's show had succeeded. Power was reconfigured, and a narrative had been born that would outlive the men who made it. After Stonehenge, the advisor was both lauded and feared. He had proved the central paradox of his craft. By manufacturing wonder, he both Which version would you prefer to believe? If a single performance at Stonehenge could rewrite loyalties, the second theater that sealed the legend was timed the slow, patient labor of storytellers, clerks, and visual artists who knew how to polish an inconvenient truth into a useful myth. Myth-making is not a single hammer blow. It is scaffolding fitted over a skeleton. The advisor's deed needed scaffolding, bards to sing, monks to write, patrons to commission, and later dynasties to claim inheritance. Each actor added a coat of varnish. Begin with oral transmission. In the immediate decades after the event, bards traveled from hall to hall. For them, a story is currency. A tale that made a house appear chosen would keep their patrons fed. Bards embellished. The eclipse had voices now. The Romans' sword hummed. The advisor's words became prophecy even if they began as stage directions. Each retelling made the narrative plainer, tidier, and more miraculous. The oral economy rewards drama over nuance. It straightens jagged events into shapes that audiences could hold. Then came the scribes. Monastic scriptoria, with their particular incentives, transformed pliable tales into authoritative chronicles. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing centuries later, did the crucial editorial work. He took scattered traditions, Welsh prophetic fragments about Merlin, the figure Ambrosius from Roman notes, and woven local lore, and he composed a continuous story. Geoffrey's genius and the danger of his project was to give a shaky array of customs and memories the weight of history. He did not merely record, he arranged. He added prophecies that conveniently anticipated his present, turning a patchwork into providence for Norman rule. When Geoffrey placed Merlin as the voice of inevitability, he did more than entertain. He issued a historical argument. Why would Geoffrey do this? History is not neutral. He wrote for patrons who needed stories that made conquest look like inheritance. Alfred the Great's descendants had reasons to see themselves as heirs of a blessed past. So too did Norman lords who sought legitimacy among Celtic populations. If a chronicle could present current rulers as fulfillment of prophecy, resistance looked both feudal and sacrilegious. Geoffrey's Merlin, the prophet who prophesied normative order, performs a political service. He sanctifies domination. That is the first arithmetic of propaganda. Religious institutions found the Merlin story both awkward and useful. Initially, an ambiguous figure whose origins brush pagan tradition showed up on the church's radar as questionable. But capturing the tale and folding it into Christian providence was a strategy. Robert de Boron and other clerical writers in the 12th to 13th centuries worked to reframe Merlin's magic as Christian miracle, or at least as a gift channeled by God rather than demons. Such adaptation made an otherwise inconvenient cultural memory serviceable. It became a hymn to divine ordination rather than a relic of older rites. Churches could then present kingship as God-ordained, using Merlin as a scaffolding for an increasingly clericalized political morality. Artists, meanwhile, provided the image that would outlive texts. Illuminated manuscripts showed a bearded sage, hands raised toward distant suns, turning a narrative into a visual shorthand. Tapestries and later, stone carvings in halls and cathedrals made Merlin into a fixture of the aesthetic of power. A painted image invests a story with authority because images persist in ways words do not. People who could not read the chronicle could still look at a tapestry and grasp the ordained past it depicted. Art is propaganda's slyest partner. It seduces what the rational mind might resist. Statecraft joined the chorus. Dynasties that wanted to claim antiquity appropriated the Merlin-Arthur narrative. The Tudors, in particular, leaned on Arthurian ancestry to fashion an image of continuity and grandeur. Princes were presented in pageants as heirs to a golden age. Coronation speeches dredged Arthur's glory and Merlin's counsel as a mirror for Tudor legitimacy. This was not accidental, it was policy. Claim a line from Arthur. and the crown acquires a mythic pedigree that makes modern disputes appear trivial. The machine of the state poets, playwrights, official histories polished that pedigree into a civic religion. Schools taught the story with the same calm assurance they used to teach the legitimacy of the state. Generations come to believe a tidy origin story because institutions repeat it. Publishing and print culture accelerated the process. When Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur was compiled and printed, it served as a one-volume source that codified many divergent traditions into a coherent romance. Mallory's Merlin, now an architect of chivalric order, mythic and moral, became the Merlin for the English-speaking world. From stage plays to printed chapbooks, the narrative leapt from local custom into mass culture. When a story becomes a commodity, a play, a book, a festival, it loops back into institutions that have power to keep selling it. A profitable origin story is a resilient one. Cultural industries extended and monetized the myth. In modern times, cinema, television, tourism, and games have repackaged Merlin into a marketable archetype, the kindly wizard, the mentor with a long beard. Theme parks profit from the romantic version. Local economies Tintagel, among them craft visitor trails that tie simple archaeological traces to extravagant claims. Museums, sometimes under pressure from tourism boards, prefer an image that sells postcards over a contested, messy past. The myth, once profitable, becomes entrenched. It's easier to promote a comforting narrative than to fund a complicated excavation. Propaganda operates in predictable stages. Capture a story, standardize it, sanctify it, and sell it. Each stage trims the edges that might embarrass the beneficiaries. The unsavory logistics of Stonehenge, the spiked ale, the calculated smoke, the targeted poison are inconvenient evidence that gets lost when the story is useful. The same technique recurs across time. A party in power captures a story, re-edits it to endorse their present, and then institutionalizes the edited tale until the original detail seems mythical or impossible. There is another mechanism at play: retroactive prophecy. Chroniclers like Geoffrey assigned predictions to Merlin that, upon inspection, read like clever re-interpretations of events that had already occurred. A prophecy that foretold a Norman victory, in fact, described a sequence Geoffrey already knew. This is a rhetorical trick as old as writing. Craft a prophecy after an outcome and then claim ancient wisdom. Retrofitting makes wonder look retrospective rather than manufactured. For an audience that prefers moral order, retrodiction counts for eternity. But propaganda is not absolute. It works because societies have structural vulnerabilities, a need for meaning, a hunger for simple legitimations of power, and institutions that profit from narratives. The Merlin myth satisfied all three. For the church, it became a device to align pagan pasts with Christian providence. For monarchs, it offered a pedigree. For towns and markets, it became income. For artists, a durable subject. For modern media, a brand. Each beneficiary adjusted Merlin to fit their needs. Over centuries, those adjustments accreted into what appears to be an immutable legend. And still the cracks remained. In Wales, older Merlin traditions continued to remember a different figure, a mad prophet of the wilderness, a victim of war rather than a royal sage. Local memory preserved contradictions that would never quite disappear. Archaeologists would later point out how sites like Tintagel show trade and contact, not the palace grandeur the myth demands. Historians remind us that the documentary record has yawning gaps. Those inconvenient facts seldom kill a myth, they complicate it. But complexity is the enemy of a neat national story. Modern politics borrows from Merlin's image without naming him. The trope of the wise counselor behind the throne functions in contemporary rhetoric the way Merlin functioned for medieval kings. Think of handlers, strategists, and spin doctors described in the press as Merlin-like, an implicit admission that we still prefer the fantasy of genius counsel to messy collective debate. The same they are social technologies. They can help bind societies together in moments of fragmentation. The same instrument that justified conquest could also have preserved learning, stabilized economies, and held together fragile polities. That ambiguity is the real unease at the heart of the story. Merlin is not only a con man or a saint. He is the technology that made moments of governance humanly possible for better and worse. When the resized, illustrated, and sermonized Merlin finally settles into shelves in libraries and scenes on screens, he is almost unrecognizable from the man who burned scrolls in a cold cave. The machine of propaganda has sanitized the mess, polished the edges, and sold the result. But the fingerprints remain, if you know where to look. The odd phrasing in a chronicle, the sudden appearance of a sword in a tomb, the local song that always ends with a warding line. Those fingerprints are small proofs that something was manufactured. They invite a different habit of attention, not to swallow the legend whole, but to taste it, ask its provenance, and study how convenience produced a miracle. The consequence is unsettling. When the past is edited into a neat origin, it tells us less about what happened and more about who benefited from the story. That is propaganda's quiet lesson. If you want to see power unmasked, follow the stories that shine the brightest, because brightness usually costs someone something. If you keep listening, the next part of this investigation asks a harder question. What do we lose when we prefer the gilded image of a Merlin over the inconvenient truth of a man who engineered consent? The answer will force us to look not only at medieval tapestries, but at the stories we elect to live by today. Strip away the tapestries, the painted halos, the convenient miracles, and what remains is not a mythic icon, but a set of practical instruments and urgent choices. The honest portrait of the figure we call Merlin is less a single man and more a role performed over and over by educated, resourceful people in a collapsing world. This reconstruction trades glamour for grit. It shows advisors who had to improvise authority out of ruin, who used knowledge to make people believe in order, and who accepted moral compromise as the price of social coherence. Think in axes. First, character. The mythical Merlin is whole cloth, immortal, omniscient, pure. The honest Merlin is ragged and heterogeneous. He is sometimes a Roman-trained clerk, fluent in Latin and the arithmetic of eclipses. He is sometimes a druidic practitioner, versed in ritual and the languages of local belief. He might be a monk who reads medical scribbles and knows enough Greek to copy a formula. He is clever, impatient, and often terrified. He believes in two things: that knowledge can shape destiny, and that power without legitimacy is fleeting. He is generous with counsel when it keeps people fed. He is ruthless when a show must be staged to prevent slaughter. He sits at the junction of learning and survival, and his temperament bears both virtues and vices. Curiosity tethered to calculation, compassion shaded by expedience. Second, objectives. The legend presents Merlin as a guardian of moral order. The reality shows more ordinary aims. Survival first of his patron, of his family, of fragile institutions that carry scrap knowledge. Stability second, forging coalitions, patching feuds with ceremony because a stitched polity is less likely to be plundered. Influence third, the advisor seeks to keep a seat at the table. That seat buys books, patronage, a scribe, a library. Sometimes these objectives align with public good, often they do not. He is not indifferent to ideology. He sometimes believes in Christianity's promise of social cohesion. Sometimes he deploys pagan rites because they work on a frightened populace. The point is not that he is a cynic or a saint, but that his aims are situational and instrumental. Third, methods. Here the romantic leaps into the factual. The advisor excels at applied knowledge. He observes the sky eclipses, comets, lunar cycles, and reads them as leverage. He keeps arithmetic tables and calendars. He keeps jars of minerals and smokes. He knows which fumes disorient and which powders stain the moonlit air red. He preserves Roman metallurgy knowledge and can polish a sword until it gleams like a relic. He stewards networks, informants at market stalls, sailors who bring news of Saxon movements, monks with access to older Roman rolls. He writes prophecies sometimes as rhetorical performance, sometimes as strategic misdirection, and ensures they are attributed to authority figures who cannot be easily contradicted. He uses herbs to calm allies and to sicken opponents when necessary. He stages pageants, processions, rediscovered relics, and carefully timed weather illusions. His laboratory may look like a cabinet of curiosities, charts, astrolabes, lead crucibles, and leather stuffed with plant matter. In short, his craft is not magic but applied technology, theater, and intelligence. Fourth, impact. The advisor's work is a force of social engineering. In the short term, he produces compliance, oaths sworn under awe, rival chieftains cowed by spectacle, and territories unified by a new story. In the long term, he creates institutions that outlive him, rituals that become coronation rites, chronicles that become sacred history, images that become civic iconography. But the impact is double-edged. The consolidation of order often means the erasure of competing voices. Local customs get recoded as corrupt pagan relics, and then made to vanish. Violence gets sanitized as divine justice. People who lose land or sons are written out of a narrative. These are decisions that quiet villages remember as loss. Historians later call them foundations. Now place him in scenes rather than adjectives. Imagine a damp room in a coastal stronghold. Outside, gulls will over a harbor where a handful of tired ships unload salted fish and the day's gossip. Inside, an advisor leans over a table lit by a rushlight. A crude astrolabe casts a small, precise shadow. He finger traces a set of tables copied from an old Roman codex. He maps a lunar occultation for the month ahead. His apprentice brings a cup of ale laced with willow bark. The senior man drinks and checks a list of names. He has letters, one from a monk at a monastery upriver, another from a trader who notes a strange influx of weaponry from the east. He writes a short speech, ritualistic language wrapped in the cadence of prophecy, and folds it into a leather purse for the warlord who will read it aloud at the stones. The scene is quiet and ordinary, but the speech, the timing, the polished sword, the red smoke, the controlled illness, these small things together become a single, decisive political action. That is the honest Merlin, a mechanic of consent, a stagehand who becomes a playwright in the theater of power. We must mark probabilities. Some claims are near certain. Advisors used astronomical knowledge to time ceremonies. Ritual and theater shaped political outcomes. Networks of monks and traders transmitted Roman learning. Other details are plausible but disputed. The exact pharmacology used to induce nausea at certain ceremonies. Whether a particular sword came from an official Roman depot or from local scavenging. Where evidence fades, hypothesis must be signaled. The reconstruction does not claim omniscience. It asks for humility. Historians uncover the scaffolding of the myth, but cannot produce every nail. That humility changes how we assign blame. The advisor is sometimes culpable for deliberate harm, targeted poisoning, manipulation, lies staged as prophecy. He is sometimes a preserver copying scrolls, teaching apprentices rudimentary medicine, shielding scholars from violent lords. Both are true. People who call him a saint or a monster simplify a figure whose choices were negotiated under pressure. He saw himself as a broker between the past and a precarious present. He traded on belief because belief made administration possible. He gambled with other people's lives to keep a fragile order intact. Whether that gamble was justified or monstrous depends on where you stand. A widow on the periphery, or a family who survived the raids because of the new coalition. There are human contradictions worth lingering on. He reads psalms and arranges sacrifices. He keeps a monastery's trust fund and a secret purse for bribes. It is full of choices we might not like, but that we can certainly recognize in our institutions, in our media, in the consultants who stage our own modern rituals. And that recognition opens a darker question. If the figure who made a kingdom possible used deception and spectacle, what does that tell us about the foundations we now consider noble? The next section shows how those foundations were polished and sold. The machinery of myth did not stop functioning the night the fires went out at Stonehenge. It kept running through books, altars, tapestries, and theaters until the manufactured narrative felt inevitable. What the honest portrait reveals is not only who the advisor was, but why generations of storytellers found it convenient to forget the man and remember the miracle. The past does not die. It keeps being rewritten. That is the essential, uncomfortable truth about legacy. Myths are durable because they are useful. The Merlin we know is the result of a long, deliberate campaign of narrative editing. In the present, his shadow is everywhere, in politics, religion, culture, and commerce. The distortion has three layers: political and social, religious and ideological, cultural and market, and each layer tells us something about how modern institutions profit from tidy origin stories. First, political and social. The advisor's most practical legacy is the template for legitimizing rulers through signs. The Stonehenge performance taught leaders a durable trick: manufacture an event that looks like divine endorsement, and resistance becomes heresy. That lesson traveled through centuries. Monarchs used ritual to naturalize succession. Councils used prophecy to justify purges. Today, political actors still stage signs, televised rallies, orchestrated spontaneous endorsements, and symbolic acts timed for maximal emotional effect. When strategists and spin doctors are called Merlin-like in newspaper profiles, that metaphor is not literary flourish. It signals a living continuity, a political culture that privileges spectacle and narrative over accountable decision-making. Consider a modern election night staged for optics. A campaign will choose a backdrop, a music cue, a scripted concession speech from a minor opponent, the slow unveil of surprise endorsements. All of these are modern equivalents of the Roman sword and the blood-red smoke. The effect is the same. The public sees a narrative unfolding and feels inclined to interpret it as destiny. The machinery of manufactured consent is slimmer and faster today, broadcast instead of bardic, but it serves the same purpose. Second, religious and ideological. The Church's role in recasting Merlin was pivotal. An initially ambivalent institution discovered that co-opting pagan heroes and reinterpreting them through Christian frames was a way to absorb and neutralize old loyalties. Reframing Merlin as a Christian prophet did not merely sanitize a story. It created a theological precedent. That providence can be read through interpreters who claim special access. That precedent persists. Religious institutions today still rely on intermediaries, prophets, charismatic leaders, supposed miracle workers to convert private conviction into public obedience. The pattern is familiar. A localized miracle becomes a shrine, then a pilgrimage economy, then a doctrinal example, then a moral authority invoked to silence critics. The Merlin story became a template for integrating the old into a new orthodoxy, and that integration taught a lesson. Syncretism can legitimize institutional expansion. Third, culture and market. This is perhaps the most visible and banal layer: Merlin as brand. Once the story was polished into romance, it became eminently sellable. Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur codified a comfortable, chivalric Merlin that fit late medieval appetites for knightly glory. The Tudors used those images to manufacture a genealogy of greatness. The printing press spread the image. Centuries later, Hollywood and theme parks exported it worldwide. Today, Merlin is a character license. Movies, television shows, casino themes, children's books, collectible figurines. Tourism boards sell Merlin trails from Tintagel to Carmarthen. Souvenir shops hawk plush wizards. Museums mount exhibitions with immersive lighting and a soundtrack of violins. The economic incentive to keep the legend intact is enormous. Towns make millions from Arthurian tourism. Theater companies sell out productions of baleful, benevolent wizards. Once a myth becomes profitable, there is massive structural pressure to keep it streamlined, picturesque, and untroubled by inconvenient facts. The mechanism of propagation is methodical. First, identify a useful narrative, a founding miracle, a noble ancestor, a saintly intermediary. Second, standardize it in authoritative texts. Third, sanctify it through liturgy, art, and official ceremonies. Fourth, monetize it through festivals, pilgrimages, books, and, in the modern age, screen productions. This is not conspiracy so much as systemic design. Different actors, from bishops to court poets to merchants, converge because each found the story useful for their immediate ends. Look at the process closely and you see how details that might embarrass the story are trimmed. Poison cups become cursed relics. Strategic illusions become divine signs. The advisor's manual, his notebooks of fumes, salts, and astronomical tables disappears into an ambiguous wisdom. Chroniclers retrofit prophecies to fit outcomes already achieved. Painters add halos where none existed. The longer the story circulates, the heavier its varnish. By the time it acquires economic value, the varnish is marketed as authenticity. This creates a feedback loop that shapes public understanding. Schools teach sanitized versions because their textbooks are cheap to produce and appealing to parents. Museums mount attractive, accessible exhibits because their funding depends on ticket sales. Films simplify because cinema needs a single, memorable hero. Each iteration prunes complexity. The cultural industries do for mythology what conservators do for paintings. Preserve the brightest colors and remove accretions that make the object messy, except the restoration. Here is selective forgetting. There is a psychological reason this works. People prefer narratives that reduce cognitive load. A single powerful image, the wise advisor at the stone, the sword in the anvil, saves the brain the trouble of weighing contingencies, structural causes, and human culpability. We want an origin story that tells us why the present exists and who to thank or blame. Myths do that work cheaply and satisfyingly. They are social heuristics. The dangerous part is that heuristics can calcify into ideology. The Merlin tale gives us a template for imagining governance, a leader chosen by fate, steered by a secretive genius. It makes certain political forms seem natural and others suspicious. That power to shape constitutional imagination is a quiet, deep form of influence. There are concrete modern echoes. Think of the media consultant turned kingmaker, the political fixer who moves the levers backstage and is then praised or vilified as genius. Think of religious leaders who claim supernatural confirmation for political positions. Think of towns where local councils fight to preserve an Arthurian attraction because it feeds businesses and fixes tax revenue. These are not identical to the 5th century advisor, but they are variations on the same structural pattern. Specialized knowledge concentrated in the hands of a few, staged as either sacred or exceptional, used to secure resources and obedience. If the legend has been useful, it has also been costly. Stories do work. They produce winners and losers. For communities whose ancestors were erased, the Merlin myth is a wound. Land claims suppressed, alternate memories marginalized. For historians, the narrative is a sieve much falls through. For the politically ambitious, the myth is a toolkit. That is why demystification is not a purely academic exercise. It is a political act. The act of naming the mechanics behind the miracle reduces the myth's normative power. It makes it harder for modern actors to misuse the same strategies unconsciously. Yet propaganda is not all-powerful. Fragments survive folk songs in Welsh that remember a mad prophet in the woods, archaeological layers at Tintagel that suggest trade rather. It will show that the myth is less an innocent story and more an ongoing lens through which we justify authority. You have watched a bright story get darker edges, a staged miracle at an ancient stone, a network of advisors who traded knowledge for power, a centuries-long campaign of narrative editing, and a modern world that still prefers the tidy origin over the messy truth. That arc is not unique. It is a template. It asks a question that will not sit quietly. If a single polished legend can justify crowns, churches, economies, and laws, then how many other foundations have been built the same way? Which historical truths shaping your sense of right and wrong are actually stories chosen because they were convenient, profitable, or calming? If an advisor could make a people kneel by manufacturing wonder, what else is our collective obedience owed to charisma, ceremony, marketing, or the careful editing of memory? Thank you for following this investigation to the end. If you want more of these dossiers, the small files that make official histories look less inevitable, subscribe, share where you watched from, and tell us which legend you want untangled next. There are always more archives to pry open. Merlin is only the first of many. What other myths have you accepted because they felt comforting, and what might we learn if we stopped believing just long enough to look?